going on, guys? It's Anos here from LunaciaAcademy, and today we'll be covering a tier list for the tail cards for Axie Infinity Origins. We're on the MTTM Notion site. They were gracious enough to let us use and make our tier list on this website, so I do highly encourage everyone to come check out this website here. Also join the MTTM Discord and the Lunacia Discord if you haven't already. I'll put some links in the description. I'll put maybe some on the video as well here, so you may see some. But today, we'll be just covering the tails. So just based on this tier list, our criteria are how versatile the card may be, how it fares on its own, how broken it is if it's min and maxed, and just a review of like all the other cards basically. I do want to note that the tier lists here are our own opinions, so it may change based on new information that may come out, new cards, etc. like that, but just based on what we can see right now, this is how we would rank them. So let me give you guys the definitions first. So for an S tier, our definition is strong enough to determine the trajectory of the meta by themselves. So for these types of cards, we assume that they'll always be played. You're always going to probably see these cards everywhere. And then for the A tier, not only has an ability that exerts control over the core game systems, but as well as multiple teams work with them. So A cards really synergize with different builds, different abilities, and they find themselves being a lot more viable than some other cards in various situations. So the B tier cards, we define them as having very minuscule flaws that don't let them take over the game consistently, or lack proper cards which in turn compromises how well they perform. So these cards may need a little bit more setup to get their min-max value out, but they're not necessarily bad cards still. They're good cards, but it's a little bit harder to get them set up. C tier we define as, it doesn't necessarily mean it's objectively bad, as the reason could also be that the meta isn't favorable for them at a specific point in time. So we're thinking back and maybe seeing like maybe counter picks, etc. like that, or like very situational times that these cards will be played. D tier cards we have does not really provide any utility or value towards the deck and could be much better utilized by using another card. And for our last tier, E, very situational, and you may find value using very specific builds. So these ones require the most setup. Your deck basically needs to kind of be built around these ones here, so you may not see them used too often. And so just jumping right into the cards here, we're going to start off with, we'll work our way down because I feel like you guys would probably want to know why or reasoning for picking the S cards and comparing it to the E cards later on. So for the S tier cards, there were a few that stood out to us the most here, which was Hotbutt, Wall Gecko, and Ant. So the reasons why we think these cards are good is, well, Hotbutt, it shuffles 3 burn cards into your opponent's discard pile, so that can be used to kind of stall them out a little bit. It reduces their utility as well. Wall Gecko, we believe, is going to be very good, especially because it reduces your damage by 30% for 4 turns. I think this will be like one of the meta cards for tanks. Although you do lose 50 HP, the risk to reward ratio per se, if you were to get attacked, taking 30% less damage for 4 turns could save you a lot of HP, right? So I do see Wall Gecko being a really strong card. Ant is very interesting because this one got, I believe, buffed from the original Substack. I think it used to be a lot less shield, but now it has a 70 shield, 1 energy, and also applies taunt for this Axie for 4 turns. We think taunt is going to be very viable, especially for tanks, because obviously you want your squishies to stay alive longer to dish out more damage. So taunting, using a taunt like on a tank per se, and having all the damage soaked on the tank, and then let's say you use Wall Gecko right after, and now the Axie is taunted, but now it takes 30% less damage for 4 turns as well. So that I can see that being a very, very strong combo where it uses a lot of utility from the enemy, and you're also getting a lot of value from defense. So going on to the next tier, tier A, what I do want to note is that they are fairly distributed evenly. So we see like a kind of natural distribution where the middle of the bunch has a lot more cards than the outer edge. So it does indicate kind of like a balanced card setup here. But going right into A here, these cards, by all means, they are not ranked in any particular order. We just considered all A. Some may be higher on the list and some may be lower. But this is what we have for what we have for A. Some of these may be a strong contender for S as well. Like I would say Yam may be a strong contender for S, especially if you're trying to build a poison team, because it does apply 2 poison to all enemies, and I believe there is a card as well that does quite significant damage, especially if you have a lot of poison stacks on them. But in this tier list, we first start off with Nutcracker, the tail card. So this card, it's pretty good because it lets you gain 6 extra damage if you have more Nutcracks of the same Axie. So with the beast cards anyways, or beast Axies per se, we do see they do have 3 parts and they can get 3 Nutcracks. So that means they're getting an extra 18 damage. So this 60 attack, 1 energy, probably closer to 70, 78 damage if you have all 3 Nutcracks. So it does get a lot of value, but the Axie itself has to be very specific for it. Going back to Yam again, I did just say they do a lot of poison damage if you have a lot of stacks. So I can see, especially if there is a lot of meta poison builds, I think Yam's probably going to be one of the integral cards to be used. Cattail, kind of the same thing as Ant here. The only difference is that it has 60 attack instead of a shield. So when we're thinking about tanks and taunting, obviously we kind of consider a tank being defensive. So a shield, in our opinion, is a little bit more value than having 60 attack. Where I can't see it being used as well as like a little offensive. Maybe you have both on the same team somehow. 2 Axies, different ones. But again, we value the shield more than attack, especially on a tank with the taunt. Twin Tail, 40 attack, 1 energy. It's a bug card. It deals 2 damage. So this one here, it's just straight damage, does 80 attack for 1 energy. So that is pretty high, especially for 1 energy cost. You do see the average around 1 energy cost around 65 attack to 70, I would say. So having an 80 attack, 1 energy is fairly good. Gravelant, kind of same scenario, 60 shield, 1 energy. Target's next ally, next turn. After target is attack, apply fear for 4 turns. So fear, basically, it shuffles a card into the opponent's deck, I believe, and then they may have a chance to pull it. So we can see the Confuse being quite viable in certain situations, especially because it's a dead card. I believe it's ethereal and unplayable, which means that it's just basically a placeholder for a card that could have been there, but now you get like a dead card, basically. Hatsune, same deal. 70 shield, 1 energy, basically equivalent to it. To rank them kind of similar. Same thing, apply to a target ally if the target is attacked. The attacker has fear for 4 turns again. So fear, basically, if you guys didn't know, it makes the attacker, every time he attacks, he puts a confused card into his draw pile. So let's say I'm attacking your Axie and I have fear on myself. Every time my Axie attacks you, it's going to get a fear card put in my deck. And now I have a chance to pull that fear card, and it basically does nothing for me, so I'm wasting value. So I can't see that being extremely strong, especially if you can get it off a lot quite frequently. Next up, we have Koi. So this one here is a 2 energy, 120 attack, which is fairly average, but the reason why we rank Koi fairly high is because we can see an abundance of Aqua Axie coming in, because we did see a lot of, like, majority of all the Axies being Aqua. So with Koi, let's say you have 2 extra Aqua Axies, that's another 30 damage. So 2 energy for 150 attack, which is pretty good. Again, our average for 1 energy is around 65 to 70, so you're getting around 75 for 1 energy if you divide it by 2 there. So Koi is fairly good, especially if we see a lot of main Aqua Axies for teams. Next up is Snake Jar. So 0 shield, 1 energy. Target any ally, negates the next HP loss against the target up to 90 HP. So this one is basically like, think of it like a trap card, think of like in Yu-Gi-Oh per se. So like if you were to attack me, I can play Snake Jar and then negate HP loss on my Axie. So I feel this card fairly good, especially it may prevent or make your opponent second guess himself when he's attacking you, because he may lose value, especially if you have a Snake Jar. Post-flight, we did see a lot of value in V2. I do think it's going to carry on to V3 as well. Reason being is because it's just a standard attack card. You do lose 35 HP, but it is 100 attack and it's 1 energy. So if you do kind of a little bit of math here, I know it's kind of unorthodox, but 30 HP minus 100 attack, that's 75 attack, 1 energy, so it is above the average for the 1 energy threshold there. So I do see this card being fairly good, even though you do lose 35 HP. Reason being, this one's an A, because you do start out with 320 HP per Axie, so you can use this quite a bit of times, and especially if you position it maybe in the center or something like that, you can see a lot of value if you get a lot of post flights. Next up is Grass Snake. So this one applies Hex for 4 turns. So Hex is basically the same as Fear, so every time the opponent attacks, it's going to shuffle a confused card into his deck, and then he has a chance of drawing it, which does absolutely nothing, so it's like a placeholder for a card that could have been there. Last in our A tier list is Navaga. We think this one is really good because if initial does 15 damage more, so it is a 70 attack base, so it is average, but if you do the extra 15 damage, it's 85 attack for 1 energy, which is fairly valued. Again, if we're going back to the average where 1 energy is usually around 65 to 70 attack. So jumping right into the B tier list. To start, we have, and again, in no particular order are these ranked, we consider them all Bs here. So Iguana applies Weak for 4 turns. So Weak, again, it's basically a debuff for the attacker, so it does 20% reduction of damage. It's fairly good, but the reason why we have it in B is because it's 60 attack for 1 energy. We do think there is other cards that are a little bit better than this one, as we've seen in the A tier column. Next up, we have Fish Snack, 70 shield, 1 energy, target next ally. This one here we have in B, so it's similar to Hatsune and Gravelant, but the difference is it applies Weak. Weak, although is very valued because it does 20% less damage for the attacker, we value Fear a lot more because it basically gives them like a dead card, whereas the Weak, they can still kind of attack and do damage. The Fear is like an absolute stop, whereas the Weak kind of prevents them slowly. So there are still fairly good debuffs, but we think Weak is a little bit less value than Fear. So the next up is Tadpole, again following our 1 energy efficiency combo. Around 1 energy is around 65 to 70 attack, so this one's 60 attack. Shuffle 1 Jinx card into your opponent's discard pile. So this one here, again, there is still some value you can get from it. The 1 Jinx card in the discard pile is not too great, but it is still there. We do think there is other cards that are a little bit better than them, but you can still get some value from this card here. Next up, we have his Hair. Now, this card used to be fairly good, especially in V2 because of the card draw. We are still going to see the card draw, but the damage is a little bit less than what we've seen in the substack. It is now 68 attack, 1 energy. So it is a little bit more balanced than what we've seen before because it was 70 attack earlier, but now it's 60. So you are still going to get the initial effect, or the main effect per se, which is the card draw, but the card has to be played first. So this one is still fairly good. Thorny Caterpillar. This one was a little interesting. It does have 100 attack, 2 energy, which means it's like 50 attack for 1 energy, but it does 50% more damage against debuffed enemies. The reason why we have this one in B is because we do think there's going to be a lot of debuffs being played in the game, so it might be fairly common to see this card come out, especially with debuff teams, because with the 50% more damage, you are looking at about 150 attack, so about 75 for 1 energy or 150 for 2 energy. So it is fairly good, but again, it's a little bit more situational for that one. Next up, we have is Feather Fan. It's a 35 attack, 2 energy, randomly deals 4 hits, and your team gains 1 feather per enemy hit. So this one is fairly decent. It is a little bit random though, because you're not going to get your dedicated damage out. So for example, let's say if the team has a lot of summons, the feathers may hit one of the summons rather than the Axies, so you might not get the damage you need out to do like a finishing shot, and it may prolong the game a little bit longer. But depending if you get feathers or not and it hits the right enemy, this one is a high risk, high reward card. So this is why we place this in B tier. Next up we have is Tiny Dino. 60 attack, 1 energy. If you retain this card, it gains 15 bonus damage per turn if retained, max 4 turns. So this card, its effect is retain, which basically means that it doesn't get reshuffled back into the deck. You always hold on to this card at the end of the turn. So if you're holding this card and you wait 4 turns, you're going to get a lot of value, but the thing is, if you get this early on, it's going to be really good playing it into mid and late game. But let's say, for example, you don't pull this until mid or even late game. For you to hang on for 4 turns may be too late, so you may not get the full value. But this card, again, if you pull it really early during your matches, I believe this one will have a lot of value carrying forward. But if you pull it later on, it may suffer a little bit based on when you pull it. Probably closer when you, like, let's say, for example, it's like 3 turns till the game's end, and you need to do like X amount of damage, and you don't get enough damage because you have to wait an extra turn. That could cost you the game. Next up we have is Gilla. So this one is the poison card that is fairly good. It does require a little bit of setup, so we do have it in B tier, but with the right poison meta team, we can see this card being very, very very meta. So this one attacks all enemies, so it does 40 attack for 2 energy. So it is not very efficient per se unless you get the setup for the poison stacks. So it does 2 bonus damage per poison stack on enemy. So the more stacks you have, the more damage this will do. So if you have a fully dedicated poison team applying the poisons and then you use Gila, I can see, especially this card, doing like a ton of damage, especially into the mid and late game. Next up we have in the B tier is the last one, 70 attack, 1 energy, deals 20 damage more if this is the only card in your hand. So this one here, it is 70 attack, 1 energy, which is fairly eco for that. It will do 20% or 20 damage more if it's the only card in your hand, which is fairly situational for that. But I believe you might be able to play into that situation where you can constantly get that 20 extra damage with the right deck. So this card is in B because it is dedicated damage, and it can do more, especially if you get the right situation. Rice is the next one in B. So this one's a very special card because this is one of the only cards that you can actually life steal from your enemy. So it will steal 40 HP. If you are full HP though, it'll gain 1 energy instead. After that, it'll be banished. So the reason why this one's not ranked higher is because it's banished. After you use it, you can't get it back unless you have a card to unbanish the card again. So this is basically a one-time use or very limited use for the card. But I can see this one getting a lot of value, especially from the lifesteal, and then getting 1 extra energy if you pull the card early. Last in our list for B is Swallow. 65 attack, 1 energy. This one here will do 15 more damage if it is initial. So we're looking at around 80 damage, 1 energy if it attacks first. So it is fairly valued. It does some dedicated damage at 65, but it does have a condition to do a little bit more damage, which is why it's in B and not lower. Next up we have is their C tier. This one here, again, no particular order are these ranked. These are just all C in our opinions. So the first one is Carrot. So 40 attack, 1 energy, gain 1 energy if this attack causes HP loss to target. So again, the 1 energy is fairly good, but to get the HP loss is fairly situational because of the shields that we're seeing from the various different cards. So if you're not getting the energy from attacking that Axie, it's basically just 40 attack, 1 energy, which is really, really low compared to the other cards we've seen. Potato Leaf is the next one, 65 attack, 1 energy, which is fairly good for the attack. Gain stealth if there's at least one living ally. So this one here, I would see it being fairly good, maybe on a combination of like a different Axie with like beast cards and bug cards. But Potato Leaf on just a plant, I don't think has too much value, because the tank is the one who wants to soak up the damage, unless you have some sort of specific combination where you want the tank to stay alive for an extra turn to possibly heal him or get more shield, but it would put this card very situational. The next up we have is Shrimp, 65 attack, 1 energy. If initial, this card attacks the furthest enemy. So it basically carries the same effect from V2 over to V3. It's going to attack the furthest Axie your enemy has. This one here is in C because it is 65 attack, and once you attack the furthest enemy, you won't be able to continuously combo him. That doesn't work the same as Shrimp in V2 where you'll attack the back and then all your other cards will attack him. I believe this card will just hit the back enemy and then all the other cards will attack the front Axie, if that makes sense. So this is why this is a C tier and not a little bit higher, because it does have 65 attack. Next up is Ranchu, 40 attack, 2 energy. Although this one does do an AoE and applies weak for 2 turns, it does lack the damage, especially comparatively to the other cards we've seen that do AoE damage. We can see Ranchu being somewhat viable, especially if you have a certain team composition that the weak would be beneficial. So let's say you have like a heal team that are fairly squishy and you need to stall a little bit. That weak for 2 turns could actually save you because they're doing 20% reduction of damage. So the next one up we have is Nemo. This one I'm happy to see still gains 1 energy from the V2. This one has a 15 heal, which is fairly good. 0 energy cost for it, so it's basically free to throw out. So we may see this one being used quite a bit. However, it is banished now comparatively to what it was before. So after you use this card, you're not going to be able to get it back again unless you have a card to unbanish it. Next one we have is Grandma's Fan, 15 attack, 1 energy, innate, attacks all enemies, apply vulnerable for 4 turns. So this card is fairly good. However, it only does 15 attack. If it did a little bit more damage, I would probably rank this one a little bit higher, just due because of innate. And so innate basically means that you'll start with the card always in your hand, and it also attacks all enemies and applies vulnerable for 4 turns, which means they'll do, well, vulnerable basically is a debuff which makes it so when you attack them, you'll do 20% more damage. So it is a fairly good utility card. However, the attack is fairly low, so it is fairly situational. Based on the type of composition you have. So I would probably run this one with a rushed composition where you're trying to get all your attack cards out and try to rush them and try to kill them as fast as possible, because they're vulnerable for 4 turns. It's fairly strong, and you'll basically always get this card at the start. Shiba is our next card, as this one's 130 attack for 2 energy, which is quite a bit. Your team gains 3 rage if this Axie is below 50% HP. So how the rage system works, we did get a little bit more information. Each time you get a rage, it goes up to 10 rage. After you hit 10 rage, you go into a rage form. The rage form, I believe, gives you double damage for 1 turn only. So it is fairly good leading up to that point if you can get that set up for that. I can see Rage being a fairly popular team, but by the sounds of it, it does sound very situational, and it sounds fairly difficult to get up to 10 Rage, but I could be wrong based on the new cards that come out there. So Rage will definitely be something very viable for sure, I can see, but it'll be very difficult to figure out the composition to make it work. Last up for the C tier, we have is Cottontail. So this one heals 15, kind of same as Nemo. You gain 1 energy and then banish. So it's basically the same thing. Again, this one, if it did a little bit more, it probably would be ranked higher, but because it's banished, and it does basically just 1 energy and then you heal for a little bit amount, it doesn't do too much, but it does have value. So the next up is the D tier list. We only got 2 in this one, which would be Poupée. 70 shield, 1 energy, target any ally next turn. After target attack is attacked, you gain 2 damage boost. So the reason why we have this in D tier is because it's a defensive card, which you're going to play on your tank, but your tank is now getting 2 damage boost. So it's kind of contradicting in a way where you're playing a defensive card on someone defensive, but now the tank, which should be just defensive, gains 2 damage boost. This card can be very situational in a sense where you can play this on maybe a more carry role, and then you're just like applying a bunch of shield on him, but that would mean you'd be lacking on the defense side of it. So this one, again, it's very situational. I can see this one being used quite a bit because of the 70 shield, but to get the 2 damage boosts out running, I feel would require a lot of setup. Same thing with Gerbil, 65 attack, 1 energy. If initial, this attack targets the second frontmost enemy. So that's very situational. As we've seen in V2, the most valued Axies are usually sitting in the back. So if you're specifically trying to attack the second frontmost enemy, which is usually the second enemy, it's going to be very, very situational. And especially if they summon a minion in front of the front tank, this one's just going to only attack the tank. So it's not going to be that good comparatively to other cards, but it really depends on how the meta goes, because we could see maybe the most valued actually sitting in the middle now instead of the back. And for our last tier, we have tier E, and the card in here is just Cloud. So the reason why we have this, it is 70 attack, 1 energy, so it is fairly dedicated damage. However, the effect is very situational. So your attack attacks the frontmost non-summoned enemy. So what this means is that if there is a summon, this one's just going to attack the frontmost enemy, which is usually the tank. So I don't really see that one being too viable compared to the other cards we have in these lists here, right? 70 attack is fairly good, but it could be swapped out for any of these other cards, which I feel would have a little bit more value compared to the effect this card has here. Well guys, that wraps it up for today's video. I appreciate you guys staying up until the end of the video here. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and follow us on Twitter if you haven't already. We'll be releasing more of these types of videos, especially the tier list. We're going to cover all the other parts in the future. So stay tuned and make sure you're subscribed to be notified when the next video comes out.